Hello and welcome to another conversation around green finance and, of course, around climate action. A lot of our conversations so far have been at the top end of this entire discussion. What's required from nations, what's required at the central level, and even what's required at the international level. What we're trying to do in today's chat is delve a little bit deeper into the importance or more nuanced approaches by states, more decentralization, and why it's extremely important for countries like India. One statistic indicates that in 1951 we had about five metropolitan cities, and by 2011 we have close to 52. And that's just the last census data we have. So that number has been increasing exponentially, actually. It's also brought with it a lot of climate action change. It's also got some data that indicates there has been large polluting that's happened because of it. And of course, through the COVID period, we saw a large migrant exodus happen across the cities and then perhaps back into the cities as they began to look for work again. What are the solutions from a climate action point of view, and more importantly, from a green finance point of view? Joining me to talk about that are two ladies who understand that space very, very well. I'm very excited actually to have an all-women panel on this one. And one of them, of course, is the author of much of what we've been discussing so far. So welcome Annapurna Mitra, who's Research Fellow and Head of Green Transitions Initiative at ORF, and Suranjali Tandon, who's Assistant Professor at NIPFP, and she specializes both in taxation and green finance. Annapurna, first word to you, because I think through the path of this conversation, we didn't get to talk about, the very organic need for a report like this, the need to delve into why this is important at this point. So just walk us through what you see as the who, what, why of this report and why it was important to talk about it now.
Thanks, Mitali, and I'm very glad too that we're on the first all-woman panel here. So about the report, so we started off with this huge number, $3 trillion over the next 10 years, which is the amount of climate smart investment that India requires. And then the second question is, where do we get that money from? And of course, the government can't pay that. It's about 10% of GDP, more than that actually, every single year for 10 years. Our private financial sector, the banks are in crisis, the NBFCs are in crisis now, infra development companies aren't doing too well. And the climate crisis is not waiting for us to sort out our financial sector. So then what do we have left? And we're left essentially with international investment. And if you look at the trends over the last decade or so, foreign portfolio investment to India has been roughly strong. There have been a few months here and there, but it's consistent. And investors are interested. But when you look at sectors like infrastructure, you see exactly the opposite. Nobody wants to invest. And when we ask why, it's essentially because they don't understand the projects. Things are unpredictable. You have a project, you don't know if you'll get the land for it, what the revenue stream will be, will costs overrun, etc. And for an investor sitting in Canada or Germany or the US, it's just too risky and too unpredictable to put their money into. And our solution basically was something we're calling a green investment bank, but essentially it's any institution that can bridge the two, a project developer somewhere in India, in Gujarat or Karnataka, and an investor in Canada or Australia, and just package that infrastructure project there in a way that's attractive to the investor. And that was the sort of overarching idea of the report. And the thing is that it was written sort of pre-COVID, or at least pre how big COVID became. We finished around April. But if you look now, everything I talk about is actually worse. So the economy is in worse shape, the government has less money, the banking sector is not doing well. And surprisingly enough, because of quantitative easing and so on, foreign liquidity is at an all-time high. So I think it translates very well for the post-COVID era. And when I think about, what that institution sitting in the middle of the two does two things. One, it has expertise in finance and in environment. So its job is to look at various projects and assess, are they viable financially, are they good for the environment? And then to sort of make the little tweaks that you need to make it financially viable when required. So in India, we've already been doing this a bit. SECI has done a very good job with, say, solar projects. So, discoms don't pay developers on time, so they put that payment guarantee in between the two. Or it's hard to acquire land, so they'll acquire the land for you or whatever. So, or you can have a credit guarantee, you can have first loss protection, you can have the first round of seed finance, whatever it takes to make that investment financially viable and then sell it forward. That's what essentially we're looking at in this.
Suranjali, let me draw you into this conversation with the other point that we were discussing, which is the need for decentralization. And I think Annapurna raises an important point when she says people don't understand the Indian landscape, and that's probably because it's so nuanced from one state to the other. Every state has its own political narrative. They have their own sort of regulatory system, their own environmental landscape, of course. In that context and with that backdrop, how important do you think it is to have this decentralization, state level conversation?
Thanks, Mitali. Annapurna has already alluded to what's happening at the national level, what the thinking is. And I believe that a lot of these discussions have happened at the international platform, wherein as you've pointed out, the countries are very different. And India is a very typical case. And therefore, I believe that the action plan has to be tailored to India's needs. So if we start at the target that we've set ourselves, let's say 33 to 35% reduction in emissions, right? In a very short span, that would require huge investment, but at the same time also will impact different states differently. So you have certain states that are excessively dependent on revenues from minerals. There are some states which are heavily dependent on agriculture and already are facing the risk of climate change, which the RBI in its new paper sort of tells us that the change in climate has had a significant bearing on the inflation in India. So there are general effects and then there are specific effects across sectors, and there are some cities, for example, and like Delhi, Noida, Bombay, which contribute significantly to the pollution. And who must bear these costs? And what is the change in the employment pattern? For example, if you do make a transition, there will be certain population which will be displaced for the want of skills, for the want of livelihood. How are they going to be taken care of as we move along the path of decarbonization? All of this needs a local level thinking. And therefore, this plan that India has signed up for requires that there should be a decentralized plan at each state level. And I would go even further to say that there are local bodies that are required to participate in this. So I believe that first, a local narrative needs to be set in India, and therefore decentralization is absolutely important.
Let me ask you a follow-up question on that, Suranjali, which is that along with this local narrative, I think the other point that, and I think the report found this as well, is that it's important to also have a sub-national financing mechanism. It can't be a one-size-fits-all financing strategy. Neither can it be that it comes to one point and then percolates. It has to go directly to the point of contact or connect. Would you agree with that? And has anything happened in that regard?
That's another interesting point, Mitali, because if we've looked at how the COVID has panned out, is that all the firefighting, I would say, has happened at the state level, at the local level, and therefore the costs are to be borne by these agencies. What we are seeing now is the fiscal fallout. Basically, who has to pay is very unclear, and how this is to be financed is getting more and more unclear. So I believe similar costs will be imposed by transition, and therefore sub-national government finances will become even more important. In my view, there are two ways to go about this. One is to say that we will implement a new tax, which is a carbon tax. And interestingly, the other day, Mr. Godrej expressed his support for a carbon tax, a uniform carbon tax. And so I believe that there is a scope to introduce this. We had the clean energy cess, which got subsumed under the GST. But there is a possibility of having such a tax. Although I would say that again, the design has to be thought through, whether the producer or the consumer is to pay. It shouldn't displace employment. Again, here I would stress again there should be a local understanding, because the academic thinking around carbon taxes has really come from the West. And there are estimates of the IMF to say that you could impose a tax of $35 a ton, which is a number we cannot implement in India because it's exactly the price of coal. So it says it double the price from here. So what I would say that one possibility is a well thought carbon tax. The second is, and I think more immediately achievable, is the borrowing, and whether states can borrow in innovative ways, or whether we can expand the capacity to borrow for targets such as decarbonization. Now, if you look at it in the COVID context, interestingly, we've given five states, some flexibility to borrow more over and above what the FRBM limits them to borrow, which is 3% of the GSDP. There are four targets that have been laid out before the states that they must achieve for this extended borrowing. And I would have been happy to see greening the system as one of the targets. But perhaps that is a way to think about it. Another way that states have thought about is the the use of special purpose vehicles or special purpose entities to take on loans which sort of get rid of the problem of the FRBM. Although, I mean, I am aware of the fact that this leads to lack of transparency, but perhaps with better reporting, there are local bodies which can raise additional funding through debt issuances, which sort of relax the norms that are set by the FRBM. So I believe it's a combination of these things which have been tried and can be experimented with in the future.
Annapurna, come in on that. I mean, why is it imperative now to have this state level conversation? And, when you guys started digging deeper into this subject, did you find that there were model cities or model states, something that really seemed to be an example that worked?
So, interestingly enough, the US the central government retreated a lot from climate action, especially in the last 5 years or so. But the US states, on the other hand, have really not dropped the beat. And so there's states like New York, Connecticut, California, which are at the forefront of trying to combat climate change and also very innovative in the methods they adopt. So I won't go over to many of them, but we spoke about Connecticut in the report we wrote because there was this one very interesting model they had. They had a triple bottom line. So instead of just looking at the investments they make and the money they get back, they also look at the environmental impact and finally at the jobs impact. And I think this is a model that translates very, very well to India because right now, there is no model that will be politically viable unless it has a jobs and growth story attached to it. There's no way we can get the government to say that, yes, we cut down emissions, but so we lose some jobs, that's not a big deal. And I think a mechanism that's able to evaluate a project on all three of these and its long-term impact, keep track of it, measure it, and report on it is something that even if it started off as a pilot, it would end up being very, very attractive to other city governments, other state governments across the country. It would be easily scaled up, I feel. And it doesn't take a lot, most of their projects are city level, things like getting renewable energy to cities, energy efficiency projects. In their context, better heating, but for us, it would be better cooling. It's not so far apart. And I think these are the kind of stories we should look at, one on the city side. The other, I think, are countries like Malaysia and the UK have been very, very good at adopting new technologies. So, for example, both have benefits that support new technologies, and especially offshore wind in the UK, because it was a technology that earlier they thought could never be scaled up, and now it's providing energy to a huge part of the country to the extent that they go 100 days at a time without using coal power at all. And that's what we should ultimately aim for. So, yeah, as a starting point, I would suggest to focus first on good city mechanisms that prioritize growth and jobs along with the environment, and alongside on technology.
I want to talk about the sectors, of course, Annapurna, but so many of our conversations so far have highlighted the fact that one of the main impediments is finance. It really boils down to that. What's your sense of what the environment on sustainable finance is right now? Because it has to check the three boxes, right? It has to deliver good returns, it has to be environmentally responsible, greater accountability. So, you have to go through that filter. Is there a willingness to go down that path and to finance in this direction?
So abroad, I think there is a huge willingness. India too has been a climate leader amongst emerging markets, and there's been a lot of statements like the Paris Agreement wouldn't be what it was if India hadn't joined up when it did. I think right now there's a risk of us dropping the ball, but the rest of the world is still going ahead full steam. EU has very clear emissions targets. China has stepped up recently at the UN General Assembly and announced a net zero target by 2060. So on the country political side, it increased. On the finance side, also there's a huge push towards sustainable finance, of which I think one of the more interesting was that the big four audit firms have come out with their own ESG framework. And this, I think, is taken seriously, could be the first step to, alongside financial audits, we have regular environment audits of what firm does. So you cannot have greenwashing, as we call it, which is that, company which is highly emitting, but they finance themselves to green bonds anyway. You try to prevent that by an ongoing evaluation of what's going on, not just in that particular one moment when they issue the bond. And I think if more and more of the global financial system moves in this direction, which other than the US, which is unclear at the moment, the UK seems to show this trend, the ECB also, the rest of the world will be forced to follow. And I think if India was to start moving towards that direction, we'd be in a place to capture that finance instead of leaving it out alone.
So, Ranjali, I want to hear your thoughts on this as well, because as we were discussing, it's clear, public expenditure can't do this alone. We need private investment. We need the pension funds coming in. What can we do to be more appealing states and more appealing stories for them?
Yeah, Mitali. So, as you're rightly pointing out that the fiscal space is not available to fund this transition. So, we need private finance. And in that space, we've made a bit of headway. If you look at the green bond issuance, that looks like a promising number. We are doing well amongst the Asians. We also have a business responsibility reporting framework, which was implemented by SEBI. Of course, how that is complied with and how do we judge companies on the basis of the ESG ratings, that's another thing to look at as a next step, but at least we've got it going. There's significant interest in the ESG market in India. Interestingly, during the COVID, we had FIIF inflows in India, some of which were on account of the Axis ESG issuance. And so, therefore, I believe that the tide has turned. There are foreign investors that are looking at India with keen interest, looking at some corporates that are keen as well to make a behavioral shift. And RBI, interestingly, in its last year's report, made a mention of climate risk and how it must be incorporated in the models, which I believe also is another major shift in thinking of how we account for these. I believe that there are different ways to attract investors. If you look at recent issuances of IREDA, which were oversubscribed, they offer a tax break. Now, whether these work or not is a separate question, but perhaps this leverages the rate of return that an investor receives and therefore covers up for all other issues such as risks related to foreign exchange or risks related to the deliverables. So I believe that there are very many ways to attract the investor, and this has to be on two ends. One is proper norm setting, and the other is probably some incentives to the investors, which could also be through credit enhancements or guarantees.
So, Suranjali, if you had to list out 4 or 5 industries that you think would be, plum candidates for this, what would you pick? We keep hearing solar, but what would it take to get the more challenging sectors, cement, oil and gas, that kind of space into this conversation?
I would think that we need to bring petroleum and coal to talk about it, because these are the major sectors that will be impacted. And it's, I would think even an FMCG, which would rely on a refrigeration, for example, should be interested in talking about the transition that will be made. So yeah.
Annapurna, final word with you. Run the time. Like, we are going to be hosting G20. It will have come off the back of COP26 in November. Hopefully, where, we're hoping to hear some very strong sort of agendas. Is this a golden spot for us? Is this the moment where we should be striking hard?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've spoken here a lot about what India can do to make itself attractive to international investors, how to make its green services have a best. But what the G20 offers is an opportunity essentially to influence the international agenda. And for that, there's a whole host of other things India could do. And the biggest, I feel, is that India has many problems. It's hard to invest. People don't know about it. Things are unpredictable, etc. But on the other side, there are also very, very restrictive regulations on financial investment abroad, particularly things like Basel or the insurance and pension fund regulations in Europe and the US, which were put in place after the financial crisis because, of course, they didn't want something like that again. But what it does is that it doesn't allow these funds, which are very, very well placed to invest in a country like India. They have a long horizon. They're looking for return. In their own countries, they're getting almost zero returns. It's just not viable. And a coming crisis for them is their aging population. Then will they have money enough for their retirement? And I think India should use that opportunity to bring international regulations to the table and look at them not just from a financial risk perspective, but as Suranjali said, build climate risk into those regulations as well as the rest of the financial system. So I think if India spends a year or so putting their own house in order now, they'll be far better placed to push that agenda 1 year down the line.
Fantastic conversation. Ladies, thank you very much for all your input. I think it's been a very granular, nuts and bolts conversation. And I hope that, through the course of the next few months, we keep talking about this as we head into the next 18 months. Thank you both for your time today.